I remember the smell of coffee. That's the thing nobody ever talks about when they write the history books. They talk about coordinates and orbital bombardment trajectories and the political fallout at the Galactic Council. They write about troop formations and casualty projections and the rate at which our communication satellites went dark. Nobody writes about the coffee. But I was standing in the break room at the lunar observation post, watching the little machine drip hot, brown liquid into a ceramic mug with a crack in the handle, and I was thinking about absolutely nothing important. I was thinking about whether I should call my sister back. I was thinking about whether the heating unit in my bunk was going to fail again. I was thinking that the coffee smelled burnt, like it always did up here, because the recycled air did something strange to the way things tasted and smelled, and you never really got used to it, you just stopped noticing. And then the proximity alarm went off. Not the gentle kind, not the routine kind that fires when a piece of debris clips the sensor array, the loud one, the one that sounds like someone screaming through a metal tube. My name is Lieutenant Commander Yale Harmon. I was 29 years old. I had been stationed at Lunar Observation Post Kessler 7 for 14 months. I had never, in those 14 months, heard that particular alarm go off with anything approaching real urgency. I dropped the mug. I didn't even register it hitting the floor. I was already running. What I saw when I reached the main observation deck was something I genuinely could not process for the first several seconds. My brain tried to sort it into familiar categories and came up completely empty. The screens showed the deep field sensors. The deep field sensors were showing objects, a lot of objects. The technician on duty, a young Moroccan kid named Farouk, barely 23, who always had earbuds in one ear and was always listening to music he never let anyone else hear, was standing in front of his console with both hands braced on the edge of it, leaning forward, and he wasn't saying anything. He was just staring. Farouk, I said his name like I was testing to see if the word still worked. What are we looking at? He turned. His face had done something complicated. I don't know, he said. I've been running the identifiers for 4 minutes. Nothing in the database, nothing even close. How many? At current count, he looked back at the screen. 412 distinct mass readings. The largest is approximately 3 kilometers in diameter. I stood there for a second. Then I hit the command channel and started talking. The next 6 hours were the kind of chaos that doesn't feel like chaos while you're inside it. When you're inside it, everything feels very clear and very cold and very fast. You move from one task to the next. You make calls. You send reports. You receive reports. You update threat assessments. You try to reach people, and sometimes you reach them, and sometimes you don't and you move on. The chaos is something you understand later, when you try to remember the sequence of events and realize you can't quite get it straight. What I can tell you with certainty is this. By hour 2, every major space agency on Earth had confirmed the contacts. By hour 4, we had our first visual. They were ships. There was no question what they were. The shapes were wrong for anything natural, angular, and deliberate, built for function in ways that made every human vessel look like a child's rough sketch by comparison. They caught the sun differently than they should have. They moved with a precision that nothing of that size had any business moving with. By hour 6, we had received a transmission. The transmission was played on every public channel within 30 minutes of its receipt. I remember watching the reaction unfold across the Earth-facing feeds, the news anchors going still, the social media feeds going from confusion to terror in a wave so fast you could almost see it moving across time zones. The Vekarath Empire had introduced themselves. I won't reproduce the full translation here because the Historical Record Division has already published it, and frankly, reading it now makes me angrier than I have the language to properly express. But the summary is this. They told us what they were. They told us what they had done to other civilizations. They told us what they intended to do to us. They told us that resistance was what they called kelvaro, a word that translated, approximately, as the futile final movements of a dying animal. They gave us 48 hours to begin the formal process of planetary surrender. They had assessed us. They had studied us remotely for, we later found out, approximately 60 years. They had watched our communications, our wars, our politics, our entertainment. They had watched us fight each other and decided that a species so divided against itself would crumble the moment a unified external force pressed against it. They were not entirely wrong about us, but they were wrong about the thing that mattered most. Section 1. Captain D. VRAJ OKFOR, 7th Rapid Defense Wing. Testimony recorded, March 2091. Location, New Nairobi Defense Command. Debrief Officer, Colonel Yusra Abadi. Let me tell you something about the 48 hours between the Vekarath transmission and first contact on the surface. People have this idea, I think, that the world fell into complete panic. And yeah, there was panic. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. You've all seen the footage. The cities, the highways, people moving in every direction because they didn't know which direction was safe. I'm not dismissing any of that. But there was another layer happening simultaneously that the cameras mostly didn't catch. I was in the military. Specifically, I was a captain in the 7th Rapid Defense Wing, which at the time was stationed about 40 kilometers outside of Harare. We had just finished a training rotation. My people were tired. We were supposed to get 2 weeks of rest rotation starting the following Tuesday. When the alert came through, I was playing cards with 3 of my sergeants in the officers' common room. Sergeant Adiz Nwasu was winning. She always won. We had a running theory that she counted cards, but nobody could ever prove it. My commanding major walked in without knocking. She looked at us. She said, "Get your people up, full kit, 20 minutes." We didn't ask questions. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I think about those early hours. The military, not just ours, all of them, everywhere, those organizations clicked into a mode that was so far beyond what the Vekarath had calculated for. They had watched our wars. They had watched us fight each other, and they had concluded that our armed forces were fragmented, politically divided, tribally motivated. And look, that's not a wrong assessment of certain periods of human history. But what they had missed, what they had watched 60 years of footage and still somehow failed to understand, was what soldiers actually are. Not their politics, not their nations, not their arguments with headquarters about resource allocation. What they are at the bottom. We are people who have trained, deliberately and at great personal cost, to function under conditions of maximum stress. We have trained our bodies. We have trained our minds. We have been deliberately broken down and rebuilt in environments designed to simulate the worst things that can happen to a human being, so that when the worst things actually happen, our hands are steady and our eyes are clear. The Vekarath had watched us fight each other. They had not understood what it meant that we had done it for so long. Major Elena Vasquez, that was my she briefed us at hour 2. She had a tablet in one hand and a cold cup of coffee in the other, and she was already operating on zero sleep, and she was the calmest person I have ever seen in my life. She told us what the sensors showed. She told us what the transmission said. She told us the projected landing sites based on current trajectory modeling, major population centers, port infrastructure, key communication nodes. She told us our assignment. Then she looked around the room at all of us and she said, very quietly, "I know this is bigger than anything we trained for, but I also know that everyone in this room has trained harder than those things out there have any idea. So we're going to do what we do. We're going to make them regret every second they spend on this planet." There were about 40 people in that room. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then someone in the back, I never found out who, said very softly, "Hua." And the room answered. The first Vekarath landers came down at hour 49. 1 hour past their own deadline, which we later found out was a deliberate psychological tactic they had used on 11 other civilizations. Give a deadline. Let it pass. Let the terror of waiting do the work for you. It worked on some people. I'm not saying it didn't. But by hour 49, a significant portion of Earth's military had had 49 hours to prepare. The Vekarath landed their initial ground forces. We're talking something in the range of 60,000 troops in the first wave, supported by aerial units that operated differently than any aircraft we had. And they advanced on their target sites with what I can only describe as absolute confidence. They had invasion templates. This was something we pieced together later from the ship records we recovered. They had a formalized process, refined over centuries, for absorbing what they called primitive biological civilizations. The template went like this: arrive with overwhelming force, demonstrate technological superiority, crush initial resistance, install local administrative puppets, begin resource extraction. It had worked 11 times. What happened on Earth was not the 12th success. What happened on Earth was something else entirely. I'll tell you about the first time I saw one. We were in a defensive position outside the city. I'm being deliberately vague about which city because some of this is still partially classified. We had prepared the position over approximately 36 hours. My people had used every bit of the terrain we had available. We had layered our concealment. We had prepositioned fallback routes. We had established overlapping fields of fire with our available weapon systems. The Vekarath unit that came down the road toward us was God. I don't know how to describe them without sounding like I'm exaggerating. They were tall, 3 meters roughly, bilateral symmetry like us, 2 arms and 2 legs, but the proportions were different, longer in the torso, shorter in the leg relative to total height. The armor they wore was not anything our military materials had seen. It absorbed sensor readings. It was a deep, lightless black that seemed to pull the air around it slightly. They had weapons. I saw what those weapons did later. I don't want to get into it. There were 40 of them in the unit, walking openly down a road in a country they had decided was already theirs. I watched them through my scope, and I felt something that surprised me. I wasn't afraid. Or I was afraid, but the fear was underneath something else, something older and harder, something that didn't have a clean civilian word for it. I gave the signal. My people did their jobs. The Vekarath unit, in the 7 seconds after my signal, experienced something they had not planned for. We weren't as advanced as them. Our weapons weren't as advanced. Our armor certainly wasn't. But we had 36 hours of knowing exactly where they were going to walk. And we had 40 soldiers who had spent years learning how to be patient, how to be still, how to wait in discomfort and cold and uncertainty and not move, not make a sound, not give anything away until the exact right moment. The Vekarath had superior technology. We had something they had never actually encountered before. Prepared human beings who had decided this was the hill they were going to stand on. Section 2, Dr. AMARAOSCI, XCNOLINGUISTICS Division, Joint Human Defense Council. Testimony recorded, June 2090. Location, Geneva Coordination Center. Debrief Officer, Director Nils Ekström. I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in the military accounts. I want to talk about the transmissions we were intercepting. My team was part of a small, somewhat improvised signals intelligence operation that had been stood up within about 18 hours of first contact. We had people from 7 different countries, 3 different academic backgrounds, and no common language among all of us. We conducted our own internal meetings in a combination of English, Mandarin, and a sign language system one of my colleagues invented on the spot over the course of the first week. We were intercepting and attempting to decode Vekarath communications. I want to be clear that attempting to decode is a massive understatement of the difficulty. We are talking about a communication system developed by a species with a fundamentally different neurological architecture than ours, using a symbol system with no overlap whatsoever with any human written language, encoding information in ways that assumed a form of sensory input humans don't possess. We were, in plain terms, trying to read something that was never meant to be readable by minds like ours. We did it anyway. It took us 11 days to crack the first layer of their basic operational communications. Not because we were slow. I will defend my team against that characterization to anyone who raises it, but because the task was genuinely unprecedented. We were working from scratch, building translation frameworks in real time, cross-referencing behavioral data from the ground reports with the signal patterns we were intercepting. The first coherent message we translated was a field report from one of their ground commanders. I remember the moment my colleague, a tiny, intense Taiwanese mathematician named Dr. Chu Wai-Lin, held up the printout and read it aloud in his careful, accented English. The Vekarath commander was reporting to his superiors. He was describing something unexpected. The word he used, repeated several times throughout the report, was one we eventually translated as, and I want to be careful here, because translation is never perfect, something in the range of persistence past expected threshold. The Vekarath had a specific term for it, a clinical term, the way you might use a clinical term for an unusual but classifiable phenomenon you'd encountered before. Except the report made clear that in this case, the phenomenon was not classifiable. The commander was saying, in essence, these creatures are not stopping. Let me give you some context for why that was significant. The Vekarath Empire had 11 previous planetary conquests in their record. We obtained their own historical documentation on 4 of those, eventually. The longest any species had maintained organized military resistance against a Vekarath invasion was 9 days. The shortest was 4 hours. The average was approximately 3 to 4 days before whatever central organizing structure the target civilization had collapsed, at which point small pockets of resistance would continue for some time, but without coordination, without supply chains, without communication. The Vekarath had built their entire invasion template around that pattern. They came in fast. They hit hard. They targeted communications and leadership structures specifically because they knew that without those things, the biological capacity of the target species to resist, however impressive it might theoretically be, was irrelevant. On day 11, when we cracked that first message, the Vekarath were dealing with a problem they had never encountered. Human beings were not following the template. Our communications had been disrupted, yes. Our satellite networks had taken heavy damage. Many of our conventional command structures had been degraded. But humans had been passing notes under doors for thousands of years before we had satellites. We had been organizing resistance movements in occupied territories long before we had radio. We had runner systems and dead drops and hand signals and mirror flashes, and every low-tech, zero-power requirement communication method that had been developed across centuries of human beings refusing to let occupiers cut them off from each other. We had not invented those methods for this moment. We had invented them across centuries of practice. The Vekarath had watched our satellite transmissions and concluded they understood our communication capacity. They had not understood that our satellite transmissions were the newest layer of something much, much older and more resilient. By day 20, the messages we were intercepting had changed in character. The clinical tone was still there. The Vekarath were, by all evidence, a highly ordered civilization, precise in their language and formal in their military communications. But underneath the clinical framing, something else was starting to come through. I shared this observation with General Meta during one of our daily briefings, and she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Say that again." I said, "I think they're unnerved." She said, "By what specifically?" I said, "By us, by the fact that we keep coming." Here is the thing about humans that the Vekarath had genuinely not accounted for. We have a word, many words in many languages for the experience of fighting when you know you are outmatched. We have stories about it. Thousands of years of stories about it. Leonidas at Thermopylae, the defense of Rorke's Drift, the siege of Stalingrad, the Chasen Reservoir, countless battles and countless conflicts where human beings, facing forces larger and better equipped than themselves, looked at their situation and decided anyway. Not because they thought they could win. Sometimes because they couldn't leave. Sometimes because of the people standing next to them. Sometimes out of something that doesn't have a rational explanation. Some deep, stubborn refusal to stop that seems to operate below the level of calculation. The Vekarath were a calculating people. They understood cost-benefit analysis. They understood strategic withdrawal. They understood the logic of accepting defeat when victory is statistically unavailable. They did not understand what it looked like when a species had been culturally encoding the irrational refusal to quit for approximately 10,000 years. They did not have a template for it. And that absence, that gap between what they expected and what they were finding, was beginning to show up in their communications in ways that my team recognized with a strange, grim satisfaction. We had cracked their language enough to read their fear. Section 3, YAELHARMON, Lunar Observation Post KESSLER 7. Personal Journal Entry, Day 23 of Incursion. Later submitted to the historical record. I've been watching the battle feeds when I can get them. Up here, there's a particular kind of helplessness that I don't know how to process. We are close enough to see the planet. We are close enough that on a clear feed, we can watch the thermal signatures of the ground engagements. We are far enough away that there is nothing we can do. Our post is still operational. We lost contact with 2 other lunar stations in the first week. One was hit by a Vekarath intercept craft. One just went dark and we don't know why. But Kessler 7 is still here. Farouk is still here, still with one earbud in. He started listening to music out loud a few days ago. Nobody asked him to. Nobody told him to stop. There's something about having music in the air that helps. I can't explain it better than that. The data coming off the Vekarath fleet has been my obsession. They are not behaving the way I expected an empire to behave. I expected confidence. I expected the careful, methodical application of overwhelming force. I expected the cold efficiency of 11 previous victories. What I am seeing instead is, and I'm aware of how this sounds, given the situation on the ground, I am seeing an organization under pressure. The fleet formations have changed 3 times in the past week. That doesn't happen with a confident force executing a plan. That happens when a plan is not producing expected results and the people running it are trying to figure out why. I'm watching an empire that believed it understood something, starting to realize it doesn't. I'm watching them start to be afraid of us. And I am sitting in a lunar observation post with burnt coffee and a cracked mug, and I am thinking, good, be afraid, be very afraid. Because you came here without understanding us, and now you're learning, and it's costing you. Every day you spend on this planet learning what we are learning what you are. And we are much faster learners than you gave us credit for. Section 4, Sergeant ADAZE NWOSU, 7th Rapid Defense Wing. Testimony recorded, April 2091. Location, New Nairobi Defense Command. Debrief Officer, Colonel Yusra Abadi. I need to talk about Day 30. Captain Akafor has probably already told you about the position. He's told everyone about the position. That's fine. It was a good position. But what he doesn't talk about, because he's like that, he leads from the front, but he doesn't like to make himself the center of the story, is what he personally did on day 30 that probably saved the lives of 14 people in my squad. So I'm going to tell it. Day 30. We had been in continuous operations for almost a month. My squad had had maybe 45 total hours of sleep in that month, in shifts, in conditions that would have been considered unacceptable under any training standard we'd ever operated under. We were cold. We were hungry. We were running low on certain categories of ammunition. 3 of my people had wounds that had been field dressed because proper medical care wasn't available. And we were still going. I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying this to make us sound heroic. I'm saying this because I think it's important for the record to show what human beings are actually capable of operating under. Not because it's comfortable, not because we weren't suffering, but because we had a reason that was bigger than the discomfort. The Vekarath unit that hit our position on day 30 was larger than anything we'd engaged before. Later analysis put it at approximately 240 combat troops, supported by 3 of their aerial platforms. They had clearly been gathering intelligence on our position for several days and had assembled a force they calculated would be sufficient to eliminate us. Their calculation was not wrong, exactly. 240 of them with air support against 31 of us was not a math problem with a comfortable answer. What they had not put into their calculation was Captain Devraj Akafer. The contact started at approximately 3:40 hours, before dawn. They timed it that way deliberately. We knew from the intercepts that the Vekarath had determined humans had degraded night vision relative to their own, and they exploited that differential consistently. They weren't wrong about that either. We do have worse night vision than they did. What they didn't account for was that we knew they knew this. Captain Akafer had been expecting a night attack for 2 days. He had restructured our defensive plan accordingly. He had positioned our heaviest weapons assets on the predicted approach vectors. He had put our best people with the thermal optics in the spots that mattered most. When the Vekarath came in the dark, they came into something that was waiting for them. I was on the eastern flank. My job was to hold that side no matter what happened and not let anything get around us. That was my entire job. Hold and don't let them flank. What I remember about that night is mostly sensory fragments. The particular sound the Vekarath energy weapons made, not like anything in any science fiction I'd ever watched, nothing that dramatic, just a sharp crackling pressure, like someone snapping the air itself. The way the thermal optic made everything green and false-colored and deeply strange. The smell of the earth and the cold, and the particular metallic smell that came when their weapons hit stone or metal. I remember my hands. I remember looking at my hands during a brief pause in the contact, maybe 40 minutes in, and they were completely steady. And I thought, why are my hands steady? And the answer that came back was very quiet and very simple, because there's work to do and hands that shake can't do the work. That's all. That's the whole answer. The captain went up the middle. I found out later. I didn't see it happen, I was occupied, but the people who were with him told me. The Vekarath were pushing hard on the center of our position. They had figured out correctly that if they broke the center, the flanks became irrelevant. It was good tactics. It was exactly the right call from a purely military logic standpoint. What they had not factored in was that the captain had figured out they were going to do exactly that. He had pulled together 11 people, himself and 10 volunteers, and he had positioned them in a place that didn't make any conventional defensive sense. When the Vekarath pushed hard on the center, those 11 people were not where the Vekarath expected them to be. They were where the Vekarath needed to not have anyone. The details of what happened in the next 22 minutes are in the official record if you want them. What I'll tell you is that at the end of those 22 minutes, the Vekarath unit broke contact and withdrew. 240 troops with air support. They pulled back. because 11 people had been in a place that didn't make sense until it made the only sense that mattered. After it was over, I found the captain sitting on a piece of broken concrete, eating a nutrient bar with the same expression he always had, which was no particular expression at all. He looked like someone who had just finished some paperwork. I sat down next to him. I said, "You knew they were going to push center." He said, "I would have pushed center." I said, "Why do you always do that?" He looked at me. He said, "Because it's my job." Then he ate the rest of his nutrient bar and asked me how my squad's ammunition situation was. That's the man. That's exactly the man. Section 5. Recovered VKARATH transmission. Translated. Recovered from destroyed command ship. Translation. Dr. Amara Osai, Dr. Chu Weilin, Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid. Translation finalized. September 2090. Note from translation team. The following is our best translation of a high command communication sent from the Vekarath ground invasion commander to the fleet admiral on day 31 of the incursion. Certain terms have no clean human equivalent. We have provided approximate translations with clarifying notes. We believe this document represents a significant historical artifact. The first moment the Vekarath command structure formally acknowledged that Earth was not following their conquest template. Transmission origin: Ground Commander Vethkara's 3rd Assault Division. Recipient: Fleet Admiral Sarath, Vekarath Imperial Command. Transmission date: Day 31 Incursion Calendar. Admiral Sarath: I am filing this report outside of standard scheduled communication intervals because I believe the information warrants immediate attention. Our conquest template has failed. Translator's note: the word used here, Kethvorath, is stronger than failed. It carries connotations of fundamental, categorical failure, the kind that invalidates the system that produced it rather than simply indicating a local error. I want to be precise about what I mean. Our technology functions, our weapons function, our armor functions, our aerial platforms have performed within expected parameters. Our logistics are intact. Our strategic assessments of their infrastructure were accurate. The template has failed not at the equipment level, but at the level of the fundamental assumption it was built on. The assumption was this: any sufficiently primitive biological civilization, when confronted with a technologically superior force, will exhibit a predictable pattern of resistance followed by collapse, followed by passive compliance. The resistance phase is typically brief and costly for the target species. The collapse phase is triggered by the destruction of central command structures and the demonstration of the futility of continued resistance. The compliance phase follows naturally once the cost of resistance becomes undeniably greater than the cost of submission. 11 civilizations, the same pattern 11 times. These creatures are not following the pattern. I have spent considerable time attempting to determine why. I have reviewed the assessment data. I have reviewed the communication intercepts from our 60-year observation period. I have debriefed my unit commanders at length, and I have arrived at a conclusion that I am aware will be uncomfortable for Imperial Command to receive. We assessed these creatures incorrectly. Not in minor ways, in fundamental ways. We observed their internal conflicts, their wars, their political divisions, their social fragmentations, and we concluded that a species so fractured could not mount effective unified resistance. This conclusion has proven incorrect. The fractures we observed appear to function, paradoxically, as a source of resilience rather than weakness. Because they have fought each other extensively, they have developed military institutions and individual warriors of a quality we did not anticipate. They have practiced the things that make resistance effective: unit cohesion under pressure, improvised adaptation, persistent operation under degraded conditions, against each other for centuries. We walked into a species that has been training for war against a capable opponent its entire recorded history. We assumed the opponent it had been training against was us. The opponent was themselves. But the training was real. Second page of transmission. I also want to address a specific phenomenon that my unit commanders have raised independently across multiple theater reports, because the consistency suggests something systematic rather than isolated. These creatures do not respond normally to the demonstration of futility. Every civilization we have previously encountered has shown a recognizable behavioral pattern when they reach the moment of understanding that they cannot win. Call it Kelmora, the recognition of inevitable outcome. Different species express it differently, but the behavioral signature is consistent. A reduction in aggressive response, an increase in protective behaviors, an eventual cessation of organized conflict as the cost-benefit analysis resolves toward survival through compliance. These creatures appear to have a different response to Kelmora than anything in our species database. When they reach the point where the rational calculation says stop, they frequently do not stop. My best commander on the ground, Vetharis, has observed engagements where small human units, clearly outmatched, clearly beyond any rational hope of victory, did not withdraw. They did not comply. They continued to fight in ways that served no logical purpose by our analytical framework. Vetharis tells me something that I am including in this report despite its subjective nature, because I believe it is operationally significant. He says they don't fight because they think they'll win. They fight because stopping is not something they have decided to do. I do not have a classification system for this behavior. I am requesting that Imperial Research Division open a formal assessment. In the meantime, Admiral, I want to be direct with you. I do not believe this incursion is proceeding toward a successful conclusion under the current operational model. These creatures are not going to comply. They are not going to reach Kelmora and stop. They are going to keep coming. Every day, in every city, in every terrain. In conditions our own troops find degraded and difficult. They are going to keep coming, and they are learning as they come, and we are paying a cost for every day we remain on this planet that I am not confident we can sustain. I await your direction. Vethkara's Ground Commander, 3rd Assault Division. Section 6, YALHARMON continued. Personal Journal, Day 38. We got the intercept this morning. Amara's team has been translating it for 6 hours. She just sent us the preliminary. I read it twice. Then I read it again. Then I went and found Farouk and I said, "Do you want to read something?" He read it. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "They're scared." I said yes. He said, "They came here to take our planet and now they're scared of us." I said yes. He was quiet for another moment. Then he took out his earbud, the one that's always in his left ear, the one he never takes out, and he put it on the console in front of him. It was a small gesture. I'm not sure he even meant it consciously, but I think it meant, I don't need music right now. I don't need anything right now. This is enough. We read the transmission again together. The part that stayed with me was the last section. The Vekarath commander trying to explain to his superiors why the template wasn't working, describing this phenomenon he couldn't classify, humans who don't stop. He was trying to figure out what was wrong with us. Nothing is wrong with us, that's the thing. Nothing is wrong with us at all. We are exactly what 10,000 years of surviving everything this universe threw at us made us. We are the species that walked into every ice age, every plague, every drought, every disaster that should have been our ending and found another way through. We are the species that, when we couldn't go around the obstacle, went through it. And when we couldn't go through it, we sat down in front of it and refused to move until the universe gave us another option. We are the species that, apparently, conducts wars against ourselves for so long and so comprehensively that when an actual alien empire shows up, we have so much practice that they cannot understand what they are looking at. I know that's a dark way to find a silver lining, but I'll take it. Section 7. General PRIYA-MEHTA, Joint Human Defense Council. Formal statement, recorded day 45. Broadcast globally via Emergency Communication Network. This is General Priyameda, speaking on behalf of the Joint Human Defense Council. I'm not going to give you a speech. I'm going to give you information, because you deserve information, and I think after the past 45 days, you have earned the right to be spoken to like adults who can handle the truth. The truth is this. We are not winning this war in any conventional sense. The Vekarath have superior technology. They have superior numbers in terms of equipment. They have centuries of conquest experience. Their individual combat troops are, by several measurable physical metrics, more capable than ours. These are facts. I am not going to stand here and pretend otherwise. The other truth is this. They came here expecting 48 hours. We are on day 45. They came here expecting our military to collapse within a week. We have units that have been in continuous operation for 6 weeks and are still going. They came here expecting to install compliance through demonstration of futility. They have found that we have a different relationship with futility than any species they have previously encountered. They came here to take our planet, and they have discovered something that I do not believe they have ever discovered before. They have discovered what it costs to try to take something from human beings who have decided not to let it go. We are not done. We are not close to done. Every day that passes, we understand them better and they understand us differently. Not better, I think, just differently. Every day, the intelligence we gather tells us more about how they move, how they think, how they communicate. Every day, our people on the ground adapt in ways that their invasion template did not account for. I am not going to tell you this will be easy. I am going to tell you that we are still here. We are still here on day 45. And we will be here on day 46. And on the day after that. Section 8, the turn. Compiled from field reports, intelligence intercepts, and post-incursion analysis. Day 57 is what the historians call the inflection point. It didn't look like an inflection point while it was happening. It looked like another brutal day of fighting in a war that had been brutal every day. The specific engagements of Day 57 are documented elsewhere in the historical record. What matters for this particular account is what was happening at the strategic level, inside the Vekarath command structure. That made Day 57 different from the 56 days that came before it. The fleet admiral had made a decision. He had been in communication with Imperial Command on the Vekarath home system for approximately 3 weeks, conducting a slow and evidently contentious debate about the status of the Earth incursion. The transmissions from Imperial Command, the ones we were able to partially translate in the months after the incursion, reveal an organization that was struggling to process information that contradicted its foundational assumptions. The Vekarath Empire had a particular understanding of its own power. That understanding was not arrogance, exactly. It was something more structural than arrogance. It was a belief system built on 11 successful conquests, on centuries of expansion, on a track record that had never been seriously interrupted. When that track record encounters something it cannot explain, the instinct for any organization, human or alien, is to question the data before questioning the belief system. Imperial Command spent approximately 3 weeks questioning the data. Then on day 54, they stopped questioning the data, because the data had become impossible to question. The cost of the Earth incursion, by day 54, exceeded the combined cost of the previous 3 Vekarath conquests. In 3 years of previous combat, across 3 separate planetary invasions, the Empire had lost fewer troops and less equipment than they had lost in 54 days on Earth. The equations had simply become impossible to rationalize. On day 57, Fleet Admiral Sareth gave the order to consolidate. Not the order to intensify. Not the order to bring in the reserve formations. The order to consolidate, which was, for anyone familiar with Vekarath military doctrine, the first step in a withdrawal sequence. On Earth, nobody knew this immediately. The people fighting didn't know. The units that pushed forward on day 58 and found the Vekarath lines had pulled back didn't know why, initially. The intelligence community, Dr. Osai's team, working through another layer of intercepts, was the first to understand what the pattern meant. Dr. Osai's account of the moment she realized. I was looking at movement data, Vekarath units pulling back from forward positions. At first I thought it might be a tactical reposition. They'd done that before, usually preceding a harder push from a different angle. So I flagged it and kept monitoring. And then I noticed the rear area formations. The Vekarath rear area formations were the logistics and support elements that don't move unless something fundamental is changing. They are the organizational infrastructure of the invasion, and they were moving. Not repositioning, not consolidating for a push. Orienting for departure. I sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then I called General Maida. She picked up on the second ring. I said, I think they're leaving. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, show me.